Hi, everybody. It's time for language of music lessons again. This is lesson 3, and we're going to talk about note naming, how to name the notes on the staff. And it starts with a history lesson. So the way that note writing has been figured out was determined by monks back about 2,000 years ago. And they were writing music for themselves, for their use in the church. And they were all men. And so they had a limited number of notes that they needed to write down. It was what they had to sing, and it was men's voices. So they developed a system of 11 equally distant lines like this. 11 lines. And on the lines and in the spaces in between the lines, they wrote what they call neumes, which are little squares. And the higher the note, the higher the neume on the system, the higher they had to sing. The lower the note on the system, the lower they had to sing, and all of the notes in between. 11 lines and spaces was enough for them to write all the notes that they needed to write. However, it is not enough for all the notes that we need to write because we're writing for women's voices and also all kinds of instruments like piccolos and bass trombones and things like that. So we need a bigger system. However, we still used their system. What we did was we took those 11 lines and we divided them into 2 groups of 5 lines. The 11th line is actually still there. It's just invisible. It's the one in the middle. So we have 5 lines here and 5 lines here. We put a sign up here that says these are treble, meaning high. And we put a sign down here which refers to bass, meaning low. And so the treble notes are written on these 5 lines. The bass notes are written on these 5 lines. La, la, la. Sounds easy, right? Not so easy. Here is what neumes look like, little squares. Notice that the 11th line, which is invisible, shows up when there's a neume written on it. That is middle C. It's on the middle line of the 11 lines, and it is common to both clefs, both the treble and the bass. It's either a low note in the treble staff or it's a high note in the bass staff. But it is the very same note, middle C, and it sounds the same regardless of where it's written. All of the notes are written either above it or below it, and they go in a straight line continuously from low to high, left to right, and the monks would read them just the way they read words and letters in books. So we have modernized things a little bit, but not much. We still have the 2 groups of 5 lines. We still have the signs, which are called clefs, written at the left side, that indicate whether they're treble or bass. We still have middle C on the middle line. We still have the notes going above and below it in order. We use letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, only those. There's only 7 of them. It's not like an alphabet that's 26. It's only 7. How hard can this be? They use those letters, and they use the lines and the spaces between the lines to write all the notes. So you end up with these. This is a piece of paper that you should have gotten in your inbox already. There is a treble staff, and these are all the notes that I chose to write on the treble staff. And there's a bass staff, again, with all the notes I chose to write. And I gave you their names. And you will find middle C over here on the bass staff, and you'll find it, about there on the treble staff. It's exactly the same note. It sounds exactly the same. The result is that we have to learn 2 whole different ways of looking at notes. The third space of the treble staff is going to look different. It's going to be a different note than the third space of the bass staff. It's annoying, and when I was in 2nd grade, I actually yelled at my piano teacher when she tried to explain this to me because I was so annoyed that I had to learn 2 different systems. But in fact, when I was about 35, somebody pointed out to me that it is not 2 systems. It is 1 system, divided up this way. For singers, we usually see treble and bass staffs. The sopranos always read from the treble staff. The altos always read from the alto staff. The treble staff. The basses always read from the bass staff. The tenors, on the other hand, often read from both of them, from either of them. They go back and forth between treble staff and bass staff, depending on the comfort level of the publisher. And it's hard on tenors, but that's what makes tenors such amazingly good musicians. So this is an indication of how the notes are actually the same, equivalent in the two different staffs where they often come together, and we see these notes all the time. So we have to be familiar with them. Now the names of the notes are something that there's no getting around the fact that you have to memorize them. But there are some tricks of the trade. You've probably heard them before. They're called mnemonic devices, and I've given them to you here. So in the treble staff, the space notes, the ones that are written in the spaces between the lines, are F-A-C-E, which spells face. Almost everybody can remember that one. Then there are the line notes, starting from the bottom line of the staff and going to the top line of the staff, and they are E, G, B, D, F, which is not so easy to remember, so we make up sentences. The classic one is every good boy does fine. I don't like that one. Only the boys get to do fine, and I have never appreciated that one. So when I learned empty garbage before dad flips, I found that much more to my liking. I had a student once named Ethan who made up his own. Ethan's gerbils bite dentists and firemen, he said. He loved gerbils. And that worked for him. He remembered the line notes all the time. I suggest you make up your own, and whatever works for you works. Then we have the base staff. And those are, I forget already, A-C-E-G. Those are the space notes. And that spells all cows eat grass, or all cars eat gas, or some other sentence of your design. Then the line notes are written down here. And those are G, B, D, F, A. Good boys deserve fudge always. No, bad sentence. Boys got all the fudge. I really didn't like it. So I learned Great Britain defeats French army, which I still don't like because it's kind of militaristic and that's really not me. So I need to make up a new sentence, and so do you. I do remember about 15 or 20 years ago, I don't know how many years ago now, George Bush was the president, and there were a number of my students at the time who were not that fond of him, and they made up a bunch of sentences because it starts with G, B, D, F, A. So George Bush does, finish the sentence however you like. It was useful to them at the time. Whatever sentence works for you is how you learn to read notes. Now, the only way to learn to read notes is to read notes. The only way to sight read is to sight read. There's some things you just can't get around in life. Too bad, I'm sorry. So what I have done is I've given you a homework assignment. It looks like this. It is a bunch of notes in random order. They are not music. Please don't try to sing them or play them. And they are just random notes. And all you have to do is name them. Now notice that I wrote whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, pairs of eighth notes. I think there's even a 16th note in here. Sometimes I gave them dots. That was just to get your eyes used to the fact that when you're naming a note, it makes no difference whether it's colored in, whether it has a stem, whether it has a dot, makes no difference to its pitch name. You have to sort of clear away all of that and just see where the note is. So I could have made it easier on you by just writing notes, like all whole notes, but then you would have only been able to name notes that looked like whole notes. So I thought, no, I got to give them a little bit more challenge than that. So anyway, what you do is you look at the note and you figure out whether it's on a line or a space. You figure out whether it is above the staff or below the staff, because that's certainly possible. You figure out the name of it, and you take as long as you need. Use your mnemonic device if that's helpful, or figure out one that you really know and work from there. So, for example, I hope I was careful. Yes, when you draw a G clef or a treble clef, it has two names, G clef, treble clef, same thing. When you draw a G clef, you have to be very, very careful to draw the circle that is at the bottom of it around the second line from the bottom of the staff. That circle goes around the second line. I hope you can see that. And if a G clef is written correctly, it will always do that. That's because that second line from the bottom is G. That's why we call it a G clef. Now you can remember that, right? The second line from the bottom is G, and the G clef will always remind you where that is. So if you can find a G, which is the very first note I gave you, and you know that's a G, second line from the bottom, then the space right above it is going to be an A. Remember, we go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we start over A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So the note after G, or higher than G, is A. So the note on the space right above that G is A. And then you work your way up, and it may take you a while. You may have to go G, A, B, C, and the next note on there, the second note on that line, is an E, and I knew that because I worked my way up. G, A, B, C, D, E. That's on the fourth space. Or I could have used my mnemonic device, F-A-C-E, and I would have known that was an E. That's two different ways of getting to the same answer. Now, for some of us, this goes really quickly. I can remember years for me where it was not quick. I knew some of them really quickly, but a lot of them I had to stop and think. And I still have trouble if there are a lot of ledger lines. That's the little lines that take you way above the staff to make the notes go higher, which is what we had to do to the Monk's system because they didn't write notes high enough for some of our sopranos. We still have to sing a little higher than they thought we did. Here's an example of a ledger line right there. Those little lines are called ledger lines. So anyway, I can remember being able to read a number of notes quickly and a whole lot of notes not so quickly, and had to really think about it. And I remember how it slowed me down, and I just didn't sit down and force myself to memorize. I don't think I have ever sat down and forced myself to memorize anything, which has been a real problem in my scholastic history. Maybe you're like me, just resistant to doing things like sitting down and memorizing stuff. Once you've got the treble clef, pretty good, then you go to the bass clef, which is down here. The bass clef is also called the F clef. And the reason it's called that is because if it's drawn carefully, yes, it was, this little mark has two dots next to it, and the two dots are just above and below the fourth line from the bottom. And that line is F. So that clef is showing you where F is. That's the F below middle C. And so if you go along, how far was it before I finally got to an F? Oh, practically to the end of the line. Here. I drew an F. Now, if I know that's F, then I can work my way down or up from there to figure out what the next note is. So the note higher than F is G. The note lower than F is E. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So I work my way up or down. Now, being a girl, being a soprano, I always learned the G clef quickly, at least a lot more quickly than I did the bass clef. And so the time that I needed to spend, and probably didn't, on the bass clef was about twice as much as the time I needed to work on the treble clef. I recommend that for all of you who say, I'm pretty good with the G clef, but I'm not so good with the treble clef, the bass clef. If you played the flute, if you played the clarinet, all you learned was the treble clef. You didn't need to learn the bass clef. Basses and tenors need to learn the bass clef. Piano players, any kind of keyboard player, has to learn both clefs. There's just no substitute for it. So I recommend, if you want to call yourself a musician, and every one of you is a musician, but could be a better musician if you knew this stuff. If you want to stand up with pride and say, during the pandemic, I became a musician, it's because you sat down and did your homework. Now, here are the instructions for the homework. This is your homework sheet. You take this sheet, you take a pencil, you get yourself into a quiet place where nobody bothers you, and you write down the names of the notes under the notes. You go through every one painstakingly. If this is quick and easy for you, good, go on to something else. But if this is hard for you, this may take a while. Once you've named the notes, go back and erase your answers. That's really important because doing it once isn't nearly as good as doing it 10 times. So tomorrow or the next day, take it out and do it again. The goal, of course, is to be able to do it fast. Now, remember when you were in kindergarten and first grade, you learned the alphabet? You remember that? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. You learned that when you were 5 or 4 or 6 or whatever. You learned not only the names to be able to say them or sing them, but you also learned what they look like on a piece of paper. Remember that those are black marks on a white piece of paper representing a sound. This mark with a line across it is A. It sounds like A. And that was what you learned when you were a little kid. And that was what made it possible for you to read everything that you read. And thank God we have language that we can read and write. Thank God we can communicate by making black marks on a white piece of paper that stand for a sound. Well, that's what this is. Black marks on a white piece of paper that stand for a sound. It's exactly the same process, only there's only 7 letters. You can do this, and I really recommend that you do it. So you write down the answers, and then you erase the answers, and you pull it out in a couple of days, and you do it again. And keep this, and keep trying it. And pretty soon it's going to get easier. It'll go quicker. Time yourself. Maybe the second time. Say, okay, it took me 10 minutes to get through this piece of paper. It took me 20 minutes to get through this piece of paper, whatever. Write that down. See if you can't beat your own record the next time. I mean, if we can't watch sports on television, we might as well make up our own games, right? Note reading quickly is your game of the week. So lesson 3 today is for you to sit down and do the drudgery work of learning how to read notes on the staff. Thank the monks every now and then for dreaming up their system, or curse them if you think that it's a terrible system, and create your own and send it in to the gods of music and see if maybe they'll create a better system. In the meantime, we're stuck with this one, and I really think you will be glad that you spent the time learning how to read notes on the system. Also, from now on in these lessons, I'm going to start referring to notes by their letter name, and you're going to want to know what I'm talking about. So here's to learning how to read notes on the staff. Here's to having a good day. We're finally into a week with a little bit higher temperatures and not a lot of rain. So I hope you get outside a lot. I hope your days are getting a little bit easier, that you're coming up with lots of fun things to do and interesting times. We will be writing about this period of time in our memoirs. Good to see you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye.